that would be great.
All right, good morning, committee. Can I get trying to get an assessment of who's here from the committee? Liz, Peter, Jared, Chris, Peter.
Dave Farnsworth, I see.
Dave is
And
here.
And Joey and Christine both said they were joining, so I imagine they're not on yet, but they should be here.
And I'm
Okay.
just a liaison. I'm not actually a committee member.
We for the purposes of every meeting previously, we've treated you as a committee member. So welcome to the club. And Gina's here. We have a quorum, I believe, so I think we can move forward.
Okay, thanks, everybody. I've just been having a conversation with Judy Dow, who would like to make some comments on 3 different topics with the committee. And I am suggesting that we take up her comments at the end within the public comment period, although she's speaking with us as a member of the Ag Committee. And Peter or Jane, if you have other ideas about that, let me know.
For now, that makes sense. I think as we're not taking up those specific issues during this meeting, I think that makes sense.
Right.
We'd love to hear Judy's comments.
Okay, so let's get going. The steering committee update from Jane is our first item.
Good morning, everybody. Just a brief update that we had a steering committee meeting of the Climate Council on Monday of this week. The meeting focused on, first and foremost, the most basic of elements, setting up a meeting schedule going forward for the Climate Council and the steering committee. So just as an update, you probably saw 5,000 canceling of meetings and updating of meetings for me yesterday, but the meeting schedule going forward will be, the full council will be meeting on Tuesdays from 1:30 to 4:30. And then the steering committees will be meeting on the off weeks of the council at 3 o'clock, 3 to 4:30. And that will start on September 14th and move concurrently through Thanksgiving, at which point we have a special meeting for now scheduled on December 1st to adopt the climate plan. In light of that, we'll come back to the schedule when we talk about work planning for cross-sector, because it's become clear to me after a number of task meetings yesterday with our consultants that the September 14th milestone of sort of the culmination of the cross-sector analyses supporting your work, as well as the preliminary presentation of the full suite of actions for cross-sector, feels aggressive to me. And so when we talk about work planning, we can dive into that date and also talk a little bit about some options that I've floated with Secretary Young and Secretary Moore as well, to think about scheduling perhaps a different date for that council meeting, which we call for a special meeting as well. So we can talk about that. We also reviewed in detail the climate action plan draft. We heard some really great feedback on the drafting of the plan itself from the steering committee, as well as the co-chairs who were able to join us that day. Marion and I are meeting this afternoon to sort of continue and advance revisions to the draft, as well as think about what the steering committee takes up next week and the full council meeting the following week after, as well as a proposal from Chris, Anthony, who's with us today, Lauren, and Leslie Ann around the input and direct process around how councilors can support the drafting of the climate action plan. We're also meeting today to refine that proposal and bring it back to the steering committee in a way that we feel like can really be additive and not feel like a burden of another committee to manage. And so in addition to that, we also hit on milestones more broadly across the coming months for the Climate Council, of which I encourage folks to look at the proposed schedule that is now on the supporting documents website and really think about it from your committee's perspective and weigh in to Marion and I about how it feels and whether or not you agree and have ideas for suggested approaches. So I'll leave it at that for the steering committee update, recognizing that I definitely don't want to shortchange our conversation around transportation today and offer the chance for any questions that there may be.
Any quick questions for Jane on that? It looks like we're going to come back to the scheduling question a little bit later. Okay. Next, we have a quick report from the electricity stakeholder meeting held a couple of days ago. And no, there's no one assigned to do that, but I'm looking right now at Liz. Can you give us a report?
Hi, everybody. Yeah, we had a good group of 50 or 60 people, many of whom had attended our meetings in some form or another, and ran through a good background on current policy for electricity sector in Vermont, along with what the key questions would be for potentially going to 100% renewable standard. But probably more importantly, the 4-hour meeting had 2 really great presentations on equity in electricity and energy policy. Folks from California presented on some of the programs that they are pursuing, and we also had a presentation on the guideposts and milestones for thinking through program design through an equity lens, and had a great conversation about that. And then in addition, also really helpfully on the policy technical side, the commissioner of Mass DOER came and spoke to us about what Massachusetts is doing and how they're stacking essentially a carbon goal with a renewable goal, taking in all resources in their electricity portfolio in some fashion or another, as well as a really great program for local distributed generation, and encouraging that. They also have a Clean Peaks program in Massachusetts that we heard about. So it was a good session. I think we had some good feedback and communication, great attendance, but like anything, it only scratched the surface too. So we encouraged folks to follow up in writing and also to come to additional meetings as we roll out this fall. Thanks.
Thanks, Liz. Questions for Liz? I just have one based on your comment about the stacking carbon and renewables together in the assessment of the portfolio. Was there any discussion about the role of nuclear going forward?
We did ask, or I think Patrick Woodcock spoke to, and then there was some follow-up on what Massachusetts does. Massachusetts has a clean energy standard, both for new and existing, that does count nuclear as well as large hydro as toward its clean energy goals, and then separately has an RPS for renewable. And he explained why they did that there. And it's essentially, it's some of the conversation we've had here. It's both to make sure that they hit their carbon goal, since from a climate change point of view, that is the primary effort, as well as to ensure they have balancing for all hours and all seasons. So it encourages both. And there wasn't a lot of communication among the Vermonters in attendance about going that way, but we did hear from him on that.
Is the modeling being done in support of the committee, taking into account those 2 types of resources, large scale hydro and nuclear?
I think Jared might be the best to ask that question, answer that question.
Sorry, Rich, could you restate it?
Well, there's the electricity task group is talking about 100% renewable policy. And I'm just asking whether a 100% renewable policy is intended to include large-scale hydro as renewable, number one. And number two, is it assumed that nuclear will drop out of the Vermont portfolio? I assume that people aren't counting nuclear as renewable, even though it might be low carbon.
I don't know the answer to either of those questions. I do see that Jane has her hand up. I don't know if it's to
Yeah, and I
comment.
thought your original question was different. I thought you asked about whether the folks who are doing modeling are taking into account the carbon intensity of various sources, including large hydro and nuclear, which is a little bit different question.
Correct.
Well,
And-
Jared, that's a question about the inventory, and you could speak to that. But I will just say that the mitigation pathways so far that have been explored through the LEAP modeling in service of the comprehensive energy plan are already thinking about the 100% res as an idea, a pathway going forward. And that work is all getting, I wish Ed was here or TJ because they could talk to it better, but that's all going to the Public Service Department this week. And then they sort of shift to how we're going to adapt that work for and what we're going to add on to that for the climate action plan. The electricity task group is meeting tomorrow, Liz, Ed, and Cadmus and EFG to sort of focus in and understand what we want to look at for the climate action plan with Cadmus and EFG. So we haven't gotten into the details yet with Liz and Ed around that.
Yeah, and the other comment is that at least, well, close to 90% of the state electricity portfolio by 2025 has pledged to be carbon-free, both GMP and VEC. And of course, we have some other utilities that are already 100% renewable. I can't speak to the carbon intensity because there are some biomass sources in there, but for a really, really significant portion of the state portfolio, it's expected to be carbon-free at and after 2025, one way or the other.
Any other questions or comments on the electricity stakeholder meeting? All right, then we're turning to the main topic for today, which is the transportation
Rich,
policy ideas. Yes.
before we do that, can I just have 1 minute to give an update from Science and Data, which met yesterday, and I think there might be some updates that are of interest to other folks on this committee. I'm going to put in the chat the link to the supporting documents, which is, all the council's supporting documents. But second from the top is the materials from yesterday's Science and Data Subcommittee meeting. And of interest there is we have a revised greenhouse gas inventory report from EFG with recommendations that the Science and Data Subcommittee, specifically the Greenhouse Gas Task Group, is going to be reviewing and then coming back at next Wednesday's meeting to work to come to consensus and agreement around forwarding that report with some more specific next steps of what those recommendations mean for our subcommittee and the council as a whole. We also got the report, which is posted at that link as well, on review of two things. One is the cost of carbon model that the Department of Public Service has developed and potential kind of enhancements to that, alongside review and recommendations around a social cost of carbon, including appropriate kind of approach to that modeling in advance of the economic modeling that'll happen through LEAP, and recommendations around choice of discount rate. And we'll be taking basically comments are due on that second paper on the social cost of carbon by the end of this week, and we'll be kind of taking up that further review of it at next Wednesday's Science and Data Subcommittee meeting, if anyone is interested in either of those.
Questions for Jared? Jared, the takeaway I get from that is that Science and Data will be considering these questions about the inventory and will be reporting out to all of the committees, including back to us. Is that right?
Yes.
And we should expect that to happen when?
The full council meeting in August, it will have an emphasis on the science and data process and recommendations.
Thank you. Okay, there's been a note that Joey hasn't been able to get on with us. Is that right?
Yeah, I don't, I've only gotten a text from her saying that she doesn't have power and she was trying to connect through her phone, but she hasn't been able to yet.
In that instance, do we want to talk about move the scheduling question up so that we can give Joey a little more time to try to arrive? Jane, you want to give
That works for me.
yeah, you want to give a sort of a here's where we are, here's where we need to be, and where we're going to fill the holes?
Yes. So I want to, because of the meeting conflict next week and then the fact that we shifted to a shorter meeting this week, I thought it was important for you all to talk about scheduling between now and into September. There were sort of two questions. One around just the basic functionality of meeting schedule, and then in order to inform how often and when you're meeting, the idea that as of right now, the September 14th Climate Council meeting is designed to have the emphasis be on cross-sector. And so that whole meeting was intended to talk about the technical analyses as put forward to support your work. So really the mitigation pathways. And then also a component of that meeting would talk about what you learned through your stakeholder engagement, recognizing that technical engagement would be completed. And I will say that as thinking through the milestones, we put cross-sector first ahead of ag and ecosystems and rural resilience, largely because they are just now planning their stakeholder engagement, and that will happen in September for them. So it feels, the cart before the horse if ag and ecosystems and rural resilience were to present their preliminary actions without having had feedback from the public on specific development of those actions. And so as of now, they're at the end of September for the September 28th council meeting, and you guys were in the middle. After the conversation with Cadmus and EFG yesterday and recognizing that there's Cadmus and EFG can only do so much without starting to engage with SEI, and there's been a lag with SEI largely around the back and forth with them and the Public Service Department in completing their work for the Public Service Department and being able to turn their attention to Cadmus and EFG so that Cadmus and EFG could be handing them the inputs that they need to run further mitigation pathways analysis, as well as develop the scenarios needed to inform your work. And so as of now, Cadmus and EFG are still shooting for the Labor Day week to come and present to all of you on that information. But that would largely be, I think that's like September 9th or something. And that would mean then that you would have to turn around, take that information and turn it in and process and present on your actions the following Tuesday. It all feels very rushed in my mind. So I reached out yesterday, thought perhaps that we could move the council meeting from the 14th to the 21st and have a special meeting on the 21st and just have the meetings back to back. Unfortunately, that doesn't work for the chair of the Climate Council as well as some others. So this is a long laundry list of me processing out loud with you all to say that what could work is if we move the meeting till October 5th, which I believe would be a Tuesday also, the week after Ag and Ecosystems and Rural Resilience, and have some more time for you all to work on your actions informed by the technical analysis. But I will just say that then you have less time between that and the end of the month, which is when you're due to come back to the Climate Council and not only present on the your final list of actions, but also discuss funding considerations as well as your consolidated assessment of the foundational criteria, which speaks to equity assessment, technical analysis, co-benefits beyond, and things like that. So I just want to say that the schedule is tight, and what I would suggest is what I want to hear from you all is that we agree that September 14th is not ideal for cross-sector. And if that's the case, we'll work on scheduling to give you all more time, recognizing that that bumps things up on the other end for you all. And then based on that, I would also suggest that next week's an off week for cross-sector. But what I've heard from a number of you is that you're open to meeting weekly, but wanting to shorten the meetings if we did that to no more than 2 hours. So want to ask you all if that sounds right. One, to bump the meeting, the third presentation to the full council to another future date, not the 14th. And then two, think about if weekly meetings in a large part for the month of September at the very least makes sense because we're going to have a lot of information from the technical consultants and going to be needing to hear from all of you and reaching consensus at this group on the actions and details associated with that from each task. So that was a lot.
All right. Thank you, Jane. Just to, you summarized at the end the two decisions that you're recommending we take. The first would be to defer our presentation of our full suite of policy recommendations. Move that from September 14 to October 5 with the whole council. And that is largely because time is short, number one, and second, we're not going to be getting modeling results from CADMIS and EFG until September 9. So I can just say that makes sense to me. Your plan makes sense to me, but why don't we take that up first?
So I think the bigger question in my mind is with any modeling process, it feels like there's a bit of call and response. And so I don't, I'm sure that the model will be, the information we get will be very good on the 9th, but I don't necessarily see that as the final product. And so I think having some time to be able to discuss and go back and ask for refinements in different runs will be very important. So I think a month is as little time as we could conceivably have for that and to put presentations together, but it's still going to be a huge lift.
So between September 9 and October 5, we would have, as you say, time for some back and forth with the modelers, and which makes sense to me also. So that's an additional reason. Any more comment on that? I'm inclined to say let's lock in October 5 and try and hold CADMIS and EFG to as early in September, coming to us as early in September as they can. Then the second question, Jane, was whether we should get on a schedule of, instead of bi-weekly meetings for this committee, having weekly meetings, but having them be shorter throughout September. Any comment from committee members on that? Gina says yes.
Jared's got his hand up.
I was just going to ask a clarifying question, not about that overall, which I'm fine with, but specifically about next Thursday, because I think, Jane, you had said kind of raised the possibility of canceling the cross-sector subcommittee meeting next Thursday. My understanding had been that Thursday the 19th for the thermal sector comprehensive energy plan / climate council co-hosted conversation, and then Thursday the 26th on transportation, both of those related to the comprehensive energy plan and the CAP, would be ones that were co-hosted by this subcommittee, so that we would be attending those. So I think I just wonder if it's worth clarifying our role and schedule with relation to those two meetings, and then what that means for cross-sector meetings alongside or in addition to those.
So yeah, of course, Jared, thank you for that. And to be honest, I just hadn't looked out at my schedule 2 weeks yet. And you're right, the transportation one was scheduled on a Thursday also. And so I knew that many members from this group would want to attend the Buildings and Thermal one next week, which is why we discussed canceling it. I imagine the same is true for transportation. And so ask you all if you want to just wait then to the following week to start a weekly schedule, or if you'd be interested in having a shorter meeting on the 26th and doing it at this time. And or I can obviously work offline to poll all of you on that, the timing, but just knowing if you want to hold and wait till September for your next meeting, or if you, yeah, okay, that's, so the 26th, and consider an earlier in the day meeting and or poll for that week more broadly.
I would encourage us to do a similar time slot to what we're doing now. I think, and I know it's complicated for folks, but I do think that we do need to meet before September, and next week is complicated for everybody. So I would encourage us to meet on the.
I don't know if this is true for like Jared and Joey, but I will just comment that that's largely the first day of school for many parents in the district. So, you know, just having kids go to school for their first day, it's a big day.
Yeah, I would prefer not to meet at that time, although I agree that we should meet sometime this week. So if it's possible to do a poll to figure out another time. I think that transportation meeting starts at 9:30 anyway and goes until 3. So an 8 to 3 meeting block would not be humane. So
That's my everyday, Jared.
Yeah, it'd be nice to have 5 minutes at least between them. So yeah, I think if we can poll to find another meeting time that week, that would be great.
So that makes sense to me. Jane, is that understood? You have a path
Yes,
there?
I will poll for that week, and then for the week that's 2 weeks from now, and then I will also schedule starting the following week on Thursdays from 11 to 1. Is that what folks would like, or would you like a 12 to 2? We're going to shorten 2 hours. Any preference?
Well, yeah, I'll express a preference, 12 to 2, but I really don't care.
Okay, that's it. That's the time.
Okay.
And then we'll work offline through our co-chair check-ins with Catherine, and I'll put that time out for others because there has been interest from other subcommittee members around work planning in off meeting times. And so as long as I don't imagine we'll have a quorum ever at those meetings, but I'll just, when we schedule these meetings, suggest when us as co-chairs meet to do some work planning for the next few weeks, invite other subcommittee members to join in if you feel strongly about how the next few weeks, months should go, so that you can provide input in that way offline here. So thank you.
All right. Thanks for all of that. And I see that Joey has been able to get online and get with us. Welcome.
I'm so sorry, but it's a little
Well,
tenuous. The lights are flickering. I'm in northern Michigan visiting my family, and like the storms have been pummeling out here, and most everyone's offline, but welcome to my aunt's house. So.
all right. So Joey and Gina, over to you.
Okay, so leaving off from where we were, Gina, you and I have not had a time to loop in on this, but last time we spent some time talking about the ZEB program, I think what Gina and I have identified is sort of setting like exploring the need for a regulatory structure or some structures that would support the general direction of more vehicle efficiency, electrification, and enabling the expansion of electrification and other strategies and raising the revenues to do that. I think one of the programs, and Gina, I defer to you too, we were hoping to explore, and I see Megan O'Toole is on the call, was one of the programs that we were looking to identify was the Transportation and Climate Initiative, or explore a little bit further with you. So that may be like the best place to start. Gina, is that where you'd like to begin?
Yeah, that was on our list that I think everybody saw at the last meeting.
Mm-hmm.
Those 3 items.
And so maybe that's a good place to start, and ideally we can get a little bit further. And it seems like we're running a little bit later, but maybe we can cover that and a couple of other things. But maybe I'll say a couple of things, turn it over to Gina, and then really turn it over to Megan and Peter as well. Because again, I think what we have identified is, unlike some of the other sectors, and certainly the electric sector, there are fewer tools in our toolbox, again, beyond the ZEV program and those important programs that require change and set a sort of regulatory framework to move in this direction. And the Transportation and Climate Initiative is a regional cap and invest program that Vermont has been participating in, sort of at the table, exploring for about a decade. And now there has been a final MOU last year signed by 3 states. Vermont has not signed that MOU. 3 of those states are moving forward in that. Many other states are still at the table, and it's a program that could provide some investment revenue to do this. And what's really important for us is looking at complementary policies that could be attached to it that would provide more guidance about how the program is structured, how dollars are allocated, with really centering equity in that discussion. So Gina, if you want to say something else, and then Peter, and maybe leaning on Megan, you've been deeply involved in this process, I think that would set an important frame.
Yeah, I just want to add that we have put this on the wall along with a lot of other things, primarily because so much work has gone into it over the last decade. A lot of analysis, a lot of modeling has gone on in terms of economics and other benefits to the state. So I think it's really worth hearing from DC and any other partners on what it is and what you know about it. We're not saying we got to do this. We're just saying it's out there. It's got some legs. Let's look at it in terms of work to date. Unlike some of the other things that, are on the table as well, such as a clean fuel standard and some other areas. So I think Peter,
Yep.
Whoever is going to take it away, please do.
I'm happy to jump in, and you're have an abundance of staff and the team supporting the work to evaluate the TCI process. So from Megan to Brian Woods and Colin Smythe and Deidre Ritzer and Ken Jones, there's lots of folks on here who have been part of our internal state team looking at the various aspects of TCI. So the TCI stands for the Transportation and Climate Initiative. There is a further acronym called the TCIP, the Transportation Climate Initiative, I think it's program, which actually is the official name for the cap and invest program associated with the work that the broader TCI structure has done. TCI as a group formed in 2010 to think about ways to reduce regionally emissions from the transportation sector. That included states at that point from kind of DC and north, some states and jurisdictions from DC north, had various participation over the years, have added states like Virginia and North Carolina has been participating and listening and thinking about things in recent years. But there's been a bunch of research done into different mechanisms, different components of the fuel delivery system as a whole and how where different points of regulation could exist to affect change. And so in the past couple of years, we've been working to develop the specifics of what a program could look like. As Joey said in last year, I think last year now, it all blends together. There was an MOU release that was signed by 3 states and the District of Columbia. And so, but other states are able to join at different points. But the idea when the negotiations and discussions occurred with the idea that some states, it may take more discussion within their states before they determine that this is the right option. Some may not go down this path at all. But the basic concept is modeled after the program in the electricity sector, known as the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI. It is a model whereby an emission cap is set regionally, and to achieve that cap, there are a series of regionally run auctions, and then a secondary market for carbon allowances, whereby a compliance entity has to purchase an equivalent number of allowances to the emissions that their fuels are responsible for. And so the proceeds from that auction then go to the states on a agreed upon formula to support reductions on the demand side for transportation fuels. So there's a cap that sets the boundary and framework, and then there's the revenue that allows for investment in programs to reduce emissions. But the two can't really be separated because that cap really acts as the backstop and conforming feature that ultimately the investment revenue helps make the cost of compliance, essentially the price of those allowances, cheaper. And so there are some great research out there. I see that Joey has dropped in something from Massachusetts. There's the official TCI website, which has all of the information on the work done to date in terms of public comment and other things. One of the areas of focus for the group, and notably it has been later in the process than it should have been, but is a significant focus on equity and how different states will integrate equity considerations into that work. That will mostly come in the form as states move forward with how they choose to invest the proceeds from that work as each ton of carbon is treated sort of universally across the region. There's not the expectation that there is going to be specific reductions in specific areas unless states choose to focus those investments in those places. So that does lead to some concerns about, sort of, are the emissions reductions happening where for those communities who are already overburdened? Think of port cities and other places with lots of traffic coming through. This program doesn't necessarily intentionally reach those specific emissions. It treats it more universally. And so that's a piece of feedback that's been given over time. As Gina mentioned, there's significant modeling out there, both in terms of the effectiveness of the program, the direct costs associated with likely impacts on the fuel markets, and then the overall economic impact, which is generally considered fairly negligible and overall positive over the course of the 10-year or the 9-year period of the program's imagination at this point. Like RGGI, the TCIP states will conduct regular reviews of both the cap stringency, essentially what is the ambition of the program, and other aspects to make sure that it is working efficiently and whether any adjustments need to be made. The history of Reggie is significant in that the cap started out as a flat cap because there wasn't clear what was going to happen. And then over the course of time, that cap has been significantly reduced once, and then on a trajectory going downward, and then adjusted again in the latest program review period. And we're about to launch into another program review for Reggie to understand what further changes might be necessary. But that's the history of those programs. The states that are involved in Reggie are also generally involved in the TCI discussion. And so that's where that sort of history and experience comes from. And I'm happy to answer any other questions or provide any other information.
One thing that I would add is I was there when it was formed in 2010. And the thing that was very different about TCI in the beginning was that the DOTs in the region are at the table and very much participating in the deliberations. This is not unlike Reggie, which was DEC and public service driven. You brought the DOTs are brought into it and have a voice and a voting voice at the table. So that makes it, because transportation is under the auspices of DOTs for a large part, not totally, obviously, but so.
Yep,
And
thanks,
gas
Tina.
tax and all
That's an
those
important point.
issues, gas tax and all those associated issues can be deliberated amongst all these states. And it's really an exercise in herding cats because you've got all these states. What is it, 11 states plus the District of Columbia? I've lost track. Plus all within each state, all these entities, public service, DEC, and transportation. So the fact that they've gotten this far in a proposal is really pretty incredible, that there's consensus on how to move forward, and a lot of different interests. Not everyone, obviously. There's, and I'm so glad that the equity is now a big part of this, but it's very broad reaching within governments, maybe not necessarily with the public the way it needs to be.
Thanks, Gina. I'm happy to speak with anybody offline about some of the equity concerns that came out of Reggie that have affected the view of TCI and how it might deal with equity concerns. I'm happy to chat with folks offline.
One other thing I'd note really quickly, and Dave, and I don't know if Megan O'Toole or anyone else on the DEC or other state team who's participating has anything else to add, but I mean, one of the reasons this keeps coming up, it came up early in our first maybe cross-sector mitigation subcommittee meeting, is something that should be on the table, is again, we don't have as many regulatory tools that require progress and raise revenue. So it is estimated that the TCIP, if Vermont participated, would generate about $19 million in the first year, 19 to 20. So I put that on the table to say, if we have, ideas for different programs and strategies we'd like to invest in, electrification, vehicle efficiency, transit, bike ped, et cetera, revenues to expand those programs. And we can do what we can with existing dollars, and we should. But if there is a greater need, and there is likely to be, we're going to need a revenue resource. And this would be approximately $20 million in the first year.
Dave?
Thanks. I just want to reiterate a couple of points that were made. I think this is a great recommendation. I'm really heartened to see that you guys are putting this out there first. So I strongly support this recommendation. TCI is a relatively moderate approach at carbon reduction. So I think Vermont's goals for reduction would probably trump, or they're just stronger than what TCI is asking for. But that said, as Joey and others have mentioned, it's a source of funding that'll be really important as we articulate our transportation strategies. It's a source of expertise. As Gina mentioned, you've got departments of transportation and other agencies across the region working together to develop solutions here. It also makes explicit provisions for equitable transportation solutions and to ensure that there's good representation of overburdened and underserved communities. That's different in Boston than it is in the Northeast Kingdom here, but those provisions are there. They're really important. States will need to take, in my view, further steps to ensure that structural equity is addressed in this context. But I think it's really important to remember that TCI provides for funding flexibility, and it's the framework that Vermont needs to work through these issues that we can't solve, as you know, just by snapping our fingers in a couple months this summer. So anyway, thanks for supporting this. I think it's a great idea.
Christine, I think you're up next.
Yep, I just want to say ditto to what Dave said. It's hard to imagine a climate action plan at this point in time that wouldn't include the TCI, and I'm very happy to see this be part of the conversation. And I think no time like the present. It's time to get on board. Thank you.
So I have a couple of questions that for clarification. Can you tell us who are the obligated entities under TCI? Who is it that has to buy the allowances? And then related to that is, what's the formula for allocating revenue? And do I understand that the real issue for us participating in TCI would be deciding how we would spend the money, because it's the mechanism of cap and invest is one where, you know, the big issue is how do you invest? So who's obligated, and is there a mechanism already established for how the money would be spent in Vermont? Or is that something the Climate Council would need to weigh in on?
So in terms of who's obligated, there's some really good detailed information in the draft model rule that we can put into chat about exactly how that would work. Or actually, I think it's a final model rule at this point. Which is the sort of the work that we've done as collectively as states to establish the starting point for states to enact the TCI program in their specific jurisdictions. In terms of the mechanism for the expenditure of those resources, there is nothing in place at this point. At the formation of RGGI, the legislature determined that the PUC would administer those funds. And for the life of RGGI, they have almost exclusively gone to weatherization programs at Efficiency Vermont and the other EEUs. So that the legislature would ultimately need to determine how to spend that and whether that's a normal part of the appropriations process or something separate.
But is that something that the Climate Council should, if we were going to recommend that Vermont join TCI officially, shouldn't the Climate Council also then recommend how we think the money should be spent?
I think there are two things we could in concept do in that regard. We could recommend specific programs in the sort of near term where those resources should go. That's one path. Or we could recommend more of a process style that, you know, some body should make recommendations to the legislature on where those things should go or should be charged with that effort. Those are sort of the two potential paths. I think we may have the revenue is some time off. So there is time to think through what that looks like.
And
Joey?
I would just sort of draw your attention to as one example of what let me just step back to say, yes, I think we would need to, provide some guidance around that. I would hope that we would. One example that I have been looking at and would encourage us to think about as an example is what what Massachusetts is doing is a complementary policy that puts greater parameters around how how the TCI program would, operate in Massachusetts, and how those revenues would be spent. Under the MOU, it does create an equity board, but their legislation in Massachusetts would expand the equity board, and this complementary legislation would direct 70% of TCI revenues to low-income marginalized communities, and that would be informed by the equity board providing guidance around that. So we, I think we could put some parameters around that, but I put that in here as an example of something that Vermont could do, and I would strongly encourage us to do to ensure that those, like not only are, to provide more guidance, but that's where the active conversation in terms of what that looks like in Vermont, I hope will move forward.
Thanks, Joey. Let me just now ask, we have limited time available this morning. Are there other topics that transportation task leads would like to put before the committee? I don't want to.
Well, how much time do we have?
Well,
we have so much.
You have
about 20 minutes more.
Okay.
Well, more than that, because we already dealt with the final pre-public meeting agenda on item on our agenda. So you have right up until public comment.
Okay.
Well, I'd like to save some time also for Judy Dow. So I want to make sure we have maybe 10 minutes at the end.
Okay. Joey, do you want to go, or do you
I mean, well, I don't want to give this conversation short shrift. I mean, one of the other tools that we had encouraged us to look at was a vehicle efficiency price adjuster, somewhat. And this is something that has been on the table in conversation in Vermont for a couple of years now, including as a pitch at the EAN summit last year. That was, I think, what Gina and I have been wrestling with and thinking about with a lot of different players and different conversations and arenas, including in the task group that we've convened, is again, what are the mechanisms to require change and send a signal to help people make, get into more efficient cars, electric cars, that sort of thing. And that is one thing that we could explore. I don't know if Jared, that's something that EAN has been working on, and you could provide a brief overview of. But we were really thinking more in the sort of regulatory structure, because in the different strategies that we have identified in terms of electrification and vehicle efficiency and demand management strategies, we can build on the existing programs that we have now, but we're going to likely need to go further, and we're going to have to embrace some regulatory tools and likely raise new revenue to do that. So I don't.
Yeah. The big buckets, if you will, are regulatory, incentive, disincentive, and then public education and coordination with various, everything from purchasers to dealers to state government, sort of a planning, education outreach component to it. So those are our buckets, but as Joey said in the beginning, we are short on policy tools, regulatory tools, because transportation, other than the California emission standards, aren't really trucks are regulated, commercial trucks are regulated, but other than that, of course, you can't speed on the highways either, but the actual distribution and consumption of fossil fuels is in the transportation sector is not highly regulated. TCA starts to get at that. So those are our buckets. And Joey's talking about a possible program to look at feebates, they're called. When you buy a new car within a certain model, should you pay more purchase and use tax than if you get an efficient vehicle? And with that efficient vehicle, maybe you'd get some kind of dividend for that. You could arrange it so that it was a price neutral situation where those buying the least efficient truck in a certain model class would have to pay more in purchase and use, and those buying the electric truck might get some kind of incentive. It's one of our potential tools in a regulatory plus incentive disincentive framework, along with a clean fuel standard, which is something that's been talked about, I know, within the context of TCI. It's going on out in California. It would have to be at a regional level, but that's another tool that's on our list here, and that would be a pretty significant undertaking if the state decided they want to do it, but it's proved to be beneficial in California. What else is on our, so where do you want to go with this?
Yeah, why don't we stop right there, because we've got some questions already.
Sure.
I'd like to hear from Jared and Liz, and then we'll flip back to Joey. Jared?
Thanks, Rich. Yeah, I just want to offer that in terms of achieving the policy framework and the regulatory and market clarity that Joey was speaking to, and then Gina, I think it is, when I reflect on this, it's clear to me that we have that in the electricity sector, either at a regional level with RGGI or at a state level with the Renewable Energy Standard. We potentially would have that at a regional level with TCI in transportation, but not yet at the state level. And at the state level for thermal, the performance standard being proposed is a clean heat standard. And so I just picking up on Gina's last point, I think given the proven models and the development work that has already been done on what are usually called low carbon fuel standards, some places call them clean fuel standards, not just California, Washington and Oregon have also implemented them, as has British Columbia, the European Union, and New York is working on one as well. I would strongly encourage, again, for regulatory and market clarity, and for lots of other benefits in terms of not picking winners in terms of specific technologies, but that we focus on overall cost-effective greenhouse gas emissions reduction, that Vermont seriously consider in advance a potential low carbon fuel standard or clean transportation standard in complement to what we already have as performance standards in the electricity sector, and would hopefully soon have as a performance standard in the thermal sector. I would also note that I don't agree with Gina's characterization that a low carbon fuel standard would have to happen at the regional level. There have been many examples where jurisdictions are doing that on their own. But I think that should be a part of the conversation. I would just go back and fully agree with everything that Dave and Christine said about TCI. I see it as a necessary but insufficient part of our climate action plan, that it is low-hanging fruit, that it is step one, that the most important question is not whether we join the program. I think if we're to be serious, we need to join the program, but the question is, what is the best and most equitable way to invest those funds? That's the big question for me, the process, and then the decisions about the investment, not whether or not to join based on the analysis I have seen.
So Jared, I'm going to push onto you a question which I've often heard from you, so which is, as you have reminded us several times, the Global Warming Solutions Act requires us to ensure that we reduce emissions in Vermont, Vermont's emissions. TCI as structured, actually at the cap side of things, doesn't do that. The emission reductions will happen somewhere, but not necessarily in Vermont. So how do you answer the objection that it doesn't actually help us meet the Global Warming Solutions Act requirements?
I think there's a few answers that I would offer. One would be those emissions reductions are going to happen regionally, and some of them are going to happen in Vermont. I think the second is, and this is why I say TCI is probably necessary but not sufficient, is that I see its primary benefit as being a market signal and a source of investment to invest in the solutions that in Vermont that will drive down emissions in Vermont. So I think, it's possible that, even through the auction and the credit system, we don't get direct, it's difficult to track the direct emissions reduction in Vermont. I think we will be able to see direct emissions reduction from the investment of, if it's done wisely, of those revenues. I think the other thing that's important to note about TCI, and Ken Jones can speak better to this than I can, but my understanding is, looking at credit card data, about 25% of the fuel that is purchased in Vermont is purchased by out-of-staters. So, and my assumption, I could be wrong in this, but I don't, I would ask Ken, is that, there are more people buying fuel in Vermont than there are Vermonters buying fuel out of state. And so in terms of the net benefit to Vermont from participating in a regional program, especially if we have these other states already participate or already in the program, and the fuel market is a regional market, and we're likely to see any price increases of TCI anyway, the question to me about it seems to be whether or not we want to be able to take advantage of the revenue that it would raise to be able to invest in improving Vermont's transportation infrastructure and lowering emissions here.
Okay, I'm just returning to the fundamental point that it's how we spend the money that is going to count here. And so I'm pushing, dialogue on this point in order to make it clear to the committee that that's where we would have to focus.
Which is why I think something like a low carbon fuel standard is so important, because TCI will not allow us to meet either our overall or our transportation sector emissions reduction requirements on its own.
I would offer I know there are other handouts, but I do want to, given the conversation, I just want to offer something as an alternative way to think about that. In the electricity sector, we account for where our the emissions from the sources of our electricity, not from the production of electricity in the state of Vermont. That is already part of the greenhouse gas inventory. There is no reason in my mind why we couldn't account for our portion of overall regional emissions within that inventory as well. So we would be joining a regional body in order to get the benefit of a larger market and overall regional emissions. Why it therefore seems appropriate to account for our component of those regional emissions, which would essentially be our declining cap as the portion of our emissions that come from the burning of diesel, on-road diesel and motor fuels and motor gasoline. So that just something to ponder, that is an arbitrary decision that we've already addressed in other forms, and one that could be the same thing could be made here.
Thanks, Peter. Liz has been waiting.
Yeah, I had what I thought was sort of a more factual question, but I think the discussion between you and Jared probably answered it. The reason to have a low carbon fuel standard in addition to joining TCI is to have a state level mandate on the type of fuel sold for direct emissions reductions here in Vermont, whereas the other is a market tool for regional greenhouse gas emissions and revenue raising. That's the short version of what I'm hearing. Did I get that right?
I think that's what I heard from Jared.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I would offer an adjustment to that, which is a low carbon fuel standard is also a market tool. Here, I'm gonna pay.
That's actually why I was originally going to ask the question. Like, to me, it feels like a big lift to do both. And so I was trying to understand, my initial framing of the question was, if we do TCI, do we have to do low carbon fuel? What's New York doing? I see they're doing low carbon fuel. What's their role in TCI? Like, it just feels like, we're going to be pushing a lot of stones up the hill. And so which is the stone that has the biggest, the best chance, the smallest stone, I guess, since we're going uphill. But anyway, or do we really need both?
I just put in the chat a link to some of what New York is looking at, including a really good 2-minute video overview of how a low carbon fuel standard would function.
Jared, do you know where New York is on the deliberations? Because NYSERDA examining it is a lot different than policy being made, and in my view, limited as it is.
Yeah, that's something I certainly want to learn more about. I would defer to others if they know. But in the meantime, there are also other states that have implemented these programs to look at.
Right. The economy, though, of Vermont is a lot different than some of
Yeah,
the
I would venture that New York is fairly far off from actually implementing a low carbon.
And
I mean, I think it should be up there. I don't know if the consultants have time, a literature review, something to help us. If the group feels like this needs to be on the agenda, I think we need more digging around on it. I certainly don't know enough about it. You know, maybe some of your staff, Peter, could help with this. I just throwing that out. If the group agrees that it's something we need to.
Well, I understand there's a pit, so it feels, well, yeah, I understand there is a pitch being developed. Jared, maybe you have more information on this for the EAN summit, along what a low carbon fuel standard in Vermont could look like. Maybe the people who are working on that pitch would be the most appropriate for that update.
Yeah, and I can share information about that when we get it. That's not me. We'll receive the pitches, but and then that will, if it's selected, that would be shared at our summit on September 15th. But there is some really good background information that was shared thanks to the event that was organized a couple of weeks ago by Alex DePillis from the Agency of Agriculture, Peggy O'Neill Vivanco from the Vermont Clean Cities Coalition, and Ryan Lamberg, that featured guest speakers from California and that spoke to the California, Washington, Oregon low carbon fuel standard programs and how they were designed and the benefits that they've been able to achieve, both in terms of emissions reduction and helping shift their transportation sectors in a cleaner, more affordable direction. So if folks want to look at that, I'll find that link and put it in the chat. There's more good information there.
All right, thanks. I think we need to move on to other topics.
can I just,
I'm going to come back to you, Joey. I just want to make sure who's in the queue. Christine, your hand is still up, but I think that's an old hand.
It is an old hand, sorry.
Joey and then Liz.
yeah, sorry, I figured I was next in the queue. And we don't, I guess what we're putting forward with TCI, I mean, the way I describe it, it's imperfect and insufficient, but it is a regulatory tool that is a regional approach that would help, I think, deepen our regional collaboration on transportation, which, as we know, doesn't, is big as a bigger thing than just, Vermont. So and your question, Liz, I think is a good one. And that's what we're hoping the consultants can help us explore. The long and short of it is we have a lot of progress to make in the transportation sector. TCI will not be enough. We are going to need other tools in our toolbox, and cleaning up the fuel supply and looking at things like a low carbon fuel standard or a clean fuel standard should be on that table. How do we begin to ratchet it down and move towards the cleaner, more efficient, and then ultimately more affordable transportation system? So I think that's why it's on the table. Every single one of these things is I spent the day with you talking about the RES the other day, which is a massive thing. And each one of these things is significant, but they have to be significant because this is a significant portion of the work we have to do. So TCI is on the table. It has been evaluated significantly. And I think the reason it keeps coming up in all the different conversations is because it's fairly well baked, and we can go further in determining how TCI works and the programs are delivered in Vermont in service of other goals, in particular equity. So that's why it's on the table. And I think other strategies like low carbon fuel standard and a fee bait and other things should also simultaneously be on the table because of the magnitude of the work that we have to do. And figuring out what that balance is of moving forward strategically and at a pace that is going to get us where we need to go in the most cost-effective way possible with centering equity at the same time.
Okay, and just to make sure that we're tracking your major recommendations or areas where that the committee should be looking at. We've been discussing TCI, a low carbon fuel standard, and a fee-bate or time of purchase price adjuster. Is that right? Those are the three big ticket items that you'd like us to have in mind?
In a regulatory context, we have other questions around EV charging, for instance, and incentive programs and how they're structured. And I mean, we right now we're asked to just talk about a few. So we put this regulatory bucket together. But we have a much longer list that Peter's seen and you've seen. The question is, how do we tackle it?
Yeah,
Does
I
this
wouldn't.
group need to tackle it? You know, EV charging and all it represents, and the various questions about deploying it in places where you need it most, as well as where people can't afford it. You know, there's lots of questions.
I want to call the group's attention back to the conversation that we started with last week on the California emission standards piece as well. So not, you know, there were four items in that sort of top of the list for transportation.
Thank you, Peter. I just dropped that in the chat. That's really important, fundamental, and a fundamental in a recommendation that we're making is ongoing and expanded participation in the ZEV program. So that's really setting a framework that we think is going to be really critical.
So just in terms of process, we've heard, we've gotten some really good feedback on ZEV, on California emissions, on TCI and Clean Fuel Standard from this group. Do we continue to package those and talk about them perhaps at the workshop on the 26th, although that's not necessarily being set up to have those kinds of conversations? I'm not sure. You know, what do we do next with these things? Because they're big issues and we need more information. And I'm kind of at a loss to figure out process-wise how our little transportation group further refines, or do we just go ahead and do it? Continue to work with Cadmus.
Feedback from the committee on the 4 regulatory topics that have been touched on and adding to the list. Peter reminds us about the California vehicle standards, including the expansion of those standards to trucks. And Dave?
I think this is a really good start. And I think we've all sort of been in this position where you come up with your best shots at first and you sit down with the consultants and they'll be able to tell you with a little bit of work on their part, what sort of results you're going to get. And then you end up prioritizing. They also have a lot of background and will be able to say, have you thought about X? That maybe is just a gap in the list of things that you present to them. So I think you're in a good position and to start with these and to continue your conversation.
Yeah, we sat down with the consultants the other day on land use alone, and it became clear to me that their time and is very, very limited, and doing research, literature searches and things like that it's not built into unless I'm missing something, and Jane can add in on that. The other thing I want to that perhaps we haven't talked about and needs to be on this list of items that you just recited, Rich, was how we spend the federal largesse that's coming down for transportation, particularly around charging and incentives. And it's not regulatory per se, but it's it's going to be really important and something I think we're going to need to talk about in the final report. You know, where are we going to get the best bang for the buck in terms of charging infrastructure, given the bill that's rapidly becoming reality?
That's a good
in
topic.
Congress?
So if I'm trying to ask questions to see how the committee members want to provide guidance to the task leads. But Gina, you just added an important fifth item.
There's others like that looming out there that.
Right. I mean, we know there are 17 or 25 different possible items, but I'm at this moment trying to give you some feedback on what would be the major items that would help us meet the 2025 and 2030 mandates in particular, and that would be the largest emission avoidance or emission reduction items. And the four that we've been talking about, plus the fifth you just named, which is providing some guidance on how any new federal infrastructure money should be spent, seem to me to be a big and important list for you guys to work on. And I think I'm just reflecting that the intersection between TCI and a low carbon fuel standard or a possible low carbon fuel standard is a topic that we really could use consulting help on, because the TCI issues, as you've said, is pretty well understood. It's been modeled, it's been studied. The California vehicle standards similarly are very well known. I think there's been a lot of work on the fee-based or time of sale incentives, but the low carbon fuel standard possibility for Vermont has not been assessed particularly to my knowledge. So that just seems like something that if you have the opportunity to ask for consulting help on, that might be one where we need at least an early assessment from the consultants as to the major pros and cons of that approach.
Yep.
I'm trying to lay out a summary of sufficient feedback for you. And we're running out of time, so I wonder whether there are final comments from anybody else.
Well,
yes.
One thought for me I'd very much like to understand, I mean, where does the ZEV program and expanded ongoing participation get us? What would participating in TCI, how far might that get us in terms of greenhouse gas emissions goals and potentially other goals too, working in conjunction with our consultants, and then pick a couple of those other strategies that may be more baked, like vehicle efficiency price adjuster, and sort of model that. I mean, I think what we're trying to do is we're baking a cake and we're trying to find what are the perfect ingredients and what are the right amount of ingredients, that we need to actually make this transition. So I think we've shared a lot of the big ideas, and as you said, low carbon fuel standard, not as well baked, but should be on the table in terms of cleaning up our fuel supply. So I think this is the work we have to do with our consultants and an ongoing conversation with you and others, and then going out and getting feedback with the public in terms of what those programs look like with uptake on the ground. So,
okay.
Yes.
Thank you. And let's stay in touch about any further follow-on questions that you've got. I'm certainly happy to speak with you and the consultants, and I'm sure other members of the committee are feeling likewise. Since we're running down to the end of this meeting, I think we should turn to hearing from a committee member from Ag and Ecosystems, Judy Dow, who's asked for a short time to raise some issues with us from her perspective. Judy, I think you're on.
Thank you for this time. So in the Ag and Eco Systems meetings, I've had lots of questions, and the response I've received is that the cross-sector committee is taking care of that. So I've been listening to your hours of your meetings, and I've not heard where you've addressed my concerns. And they're primarily all around equity. And I've heard you speak of equity many times. I've heard you speak of money and economy and the best buck for your bang and all of that stuff many, many times. But that does not necessarily equate to equality. And I just want to make sure that you understand the 4 equitable, sustainable questions that came from the Ag and Eco Committee and was embedded into the guiding principles is understood. So is there fairness to everything is one of the guiding principles. And so embedded into all of your equity concerns should be, is there fairness to everything? All living things, all non-living things. And so one of the areas that I've addressed is tourism. And is there a role for hospitality to play in this emissions that are coming from all these tourists visiting Vermont? And I'm thinking something like even a bus or some kind of transportation that will get a large number of people from the hotel to the ski area. That type of a thing is what I'm thinking of. And the other one is electric cars. There's a lot of discussion about electric cars, and there processes for in both electric cars and solar panels for recycling the toxic materials in the batteries. Is there consideration as to where this electricity is coming from to run these things? Because when you start looking at the issues globally, Hydro-Quebec is expanding constantly, taking one native village after another. And these villages don't even have drinking water because there's been so much mercury released from the land into the water. They now pay $17 for a liter of drinking water because the mercury is in the water and they can't drink it. They've lost their hunting grounds. One village after another has been relocated many times right next to the dam, and they don't even have electricity. So when you're looking at equity, you need to look more globally in those areas. Also, there's a concern I have about the making of solar panels. And I keep thinking back, I'm old enough to remember many laws and changes and environmental changes. And one I keep remembering is about everybody complaining about packaging and how much packaging there was and how they tried to do that, fix it so there was little to no packaging involved. And my concern is when you're looking at these solar panels is where are these materials coming from? Are children being used to mine the materials? Are reservations being desecrated to mine the materials? Look at these issues more globally. I just quickly read the paper that you gave us. You just gave us on TCI, and I was told that there was equity in there, but the equity, there's no methods on how to do equity, how to show it, or how it's even going to happen. And it says ensuring polluters pay for the pollution, they are responsible and sharing costs and benefits equitably in ways that best benefit communities. That doesn't really mean that's going to help those marginalized people, just as the renting project that you presented on August 5th. That doesn't mean it's going to reach, those benefits are going to reach those marginalized people, what you presented. So I guess what my point is that if something's to be equitable, it needs to be embedded in every discussion. There needs to be a how it's going to happen. We need to see something concrete as to how it happens, not a generic, well, we like this plan and we like that plan. And I was being told, and the ag and ecosystem, that you were addressing this, but after listening to, I think, 14 hours of your meetings, I don't see it. I don't see how this is being addressed equitably in the things you're talking about. So I'd like to have a discussion about that.
Well, thank you for the challenge. I'll put it that way. I mean, we don't have time this morning to follow up on all of those points.
So could I get on the agenda then so we can discuss this issue at a later time?
I can't say right now. I think we're going to have to discuss that at the steering committee level.
Well, so one of the things that I realized from your meetings is when you have public comment, people ask questions, but they never get answered. And I really want answers. And I love a discussion about it.
Judy, I appreciate those questions and the prompts that they give. I think where you are not hearing the level of specificity that's required to implement these is because of where in the process these policies are, right? They can take on many different forms at this point. We've all been thinking through what potential equity impacts each of them might have and how in the process of evaluating them and designing them, those are taken into account. But at this point, they're not specific enough to be able to say, this is how those concerns will be addressed. And I think we hear you, and we've been pondering through all of those things and using the guiding principles as we think through them. But it really is to a point where having more specificity is necessary in order to say then, how would we implement those to make sure that we follow through on the commitment that we've all made to those principles.
Well, so I think if you're to do that, you need to look at the guiding principles and understand there are equitable things in there that you should be following, because right now you're not following them.
Do you mean, Judy, we're not following them in because we're not talking about them, or because we haven't designed policies that would address them? Because as Peter just said, we haven't selected policy initiatives yet. And
well, you're not talking about them, because there's one that says that you need to be looking at is reduction of consumption happening. But you keep talking about ways of making it affordable. We don't want it affordable, we want it reduced.
So I would disagree with that right off the bat, that underlying all of our efforts are to create those reductions. I think we have an interest across the board in understanding what the costs of those reductions are, because that's part of our charge. But certainly it starts with a reduction in consumption and a reduction in emissions. That is the starting point. That's not the only outcome that we're tasked with pursuing. So I would disagree with you, Judy, that those are not in consideration.
Okay, that's fine.
Jane?
Accept your differing opinion, but I would like a discussion about this, because I know in all the hours I'm spending, I'm being told you're taking care of this. And I also know in all the hours I've watched, I don't feel you are taking care of it. So I would like a discussion on it at some point, not at the end either.
I'm hearing you, Judy. Thank you. Jane, you have your hand up.
Well, I appreciate the back and forth and the discussion and recognize it needs more time. But I did just want to suggest that we are moving forward with, and this is not to be the end all of everything, but I did just want to suggest that through the Just Transitions subcommittee, we've developed a scope of work to support subcommittees in having a transparent conversation about the application of the guiding principles and the scoring rubric. And we sent out a scope of work to bring facilitation help on board to support subcommittees in the month of October as they're lifting up actions for prioritization. And so the idea being that that person would support, come in, lead transparent conversations around how equity is being considered in these actions and ultimately policies that are considered and put in as recommendations into the CAP. I've already had conversations this week with two candidates who are submitting bids and one candidate that declined, and we haven't heard from one other, but my hope and interest is to have that person on board by early September, and that person would help bring support to subcommittees who are grappling with this to have more open and obvious conversations about it in these public meetings. And that would happen here and then ultimately also happen in the council level process in October. So I just wanted to at least, it is not enough probably, or the be all end all for anything, but it is a really intentional step in the process to highlight the role and application of the tools that have been developed by Just Transitions for subcommittee support.
Jane, if I could ask you a question directly too. You've sat through our meetings, you've heard my questions, you've heard Billy say either Just Transitions or this committee was taking care of those things. Is there some kind of a mechanism that is allowing concerns of one committee to be shared with another committee? And if so, was this committee aware of the concerns being discussed in the Ag and Ecosystem Committee?
The specific concerns that were just highlighted earlier, I think that some of them have been flagged around renewables here and the impacts.
That's not my question. My question is there a mechanism to share that between committees, to share concerns?
Yes, the mechanism is that we have liaisons to each of the other subcommittees.
And are they shared in those meetings?
Those concerns, those concerns as determined by the liaison have shared. So we are relying on that person.
So then I can assume the liaison from Ag and Eco did not share them. Because this is not the only committee that I'm hearing this from. I'm hearing other committees have concerns and they're being told it's being passed on to another committee, but I'm not sure it's happening. I'm not sure it's really being passed on. And I want to make sure that there is a mechanism that is doing that. And if it's through the liaison, do the liaison need to know, do they understand that's their role?
I think that's
an important.
Right. That's a really good point. And the idea of the liaison was from each committee was to make sure that that could happen. That's certainly my intention, to be able to hear from concerns that are being raised in any of the other committees. So, and I would like to make sure that we have time to do that. There are questions of fairness, equity, and cost lurking in every single policy. And we want to make sure that we hear as much as we can about them, time permitting, and the schedule that the legislature has us on permitting. We're past our time today, so let me just turn to Joey and then Dave for comments that you may have on this.
I just want to thank Judy for raising some really important points. I would just also say that we have not yet had the time to get to the granular level, and that's what we're sort of, there's this tension between high concept policies and programs and getting down to the programmatic level of like, how do you actually design the program and the policy to be most equitable? And that's really, we need more work there. And I welcome that conversation with you and others, but appreciate a lot of what you're raising. I would also just note that, like, I mean, what we're trying to lift here is incredibly challenging. And I hope people have read the IPCC report, because it sets a frame for this work and clarity around the deep inequity of the status quo, and the time we have to each do our part as individuals and as states and as communities, and ensure, to the point you were raising, Judy, which I totally support, that we think about equity beyond our borders. So this is really critical. So I'm very much looking forward to a further conversation with you, but also recognizing the magnitude of the lift we have before us.
Which is another issue I've been sharing for quite a while now. If we need more time, let's ask for it.
And I think that, I mean, which is one of the reasons I feel like in some ways we should be identifying very big things that we should move forward. And this is where we get to the CAP design process that Jane has walked through, and there's a different sort of iteration of that. What can we be advancing now to begin to turn the ship? And what else needs more work to get the equity components and other components, including the affordability components, as Peter noted, right. But I highly encourage everyone to read and familiarize themselves with the IPCC report and to inform this work.
Dave.
Yeah, Judy, I've put my email in the chat. I'd love to talk with you more about this. This sounds obviously really unsatisfying to you, but let's talk about this some more. Maybe it can be helpful.
Thank you.
All right. Any other comments? We are well past time, and we asked Judy to go first as a member of the council representing ag and ecosystems, but there are public members present who may wish to address the committee. Any other comments? I would add to Dave's comment, Judy, I'd be really happy to talk with you. We may have more time privately or just in a separate conversation than we're going to have available in the full committee.
Thank you.
George.
Morning. So I've been watching this conversation about the transportation sector part of the climate action plan. And I think one of the central unspoken issues here might be that on a day-to-day basis, when it's actually time to execute this plan, no party has been identified to actually execute it. And what I'd like to propose is a innovation, or perhaps a possible path forward to put into play in your framework, is, for lack of a better, something I'll call Vermont Clean Transportation Authority, a nonprofit public corporation whose day-to-day responsibility is to execute the climate action plan in the transportation sector. It would resemble something like a financial services company, in the sense that it would be funded by the TCI revenue stream and use those monies as a way to allocate various loans and financing, transmission upgrades, EV purchases, anything within the scope of the transportation problem space. public transportation infrastructure, bus and rails. I mean, there's many different facets of it. Loan repayment might be financed by having the people who buy an EV pay back the loan using the cost savings they enjoy from driving an electric vehicle, which can be on the order, in my experience, of 30% or more. If they were also able to do some form of a rebate mechanism for fuel purchases, so that those of lesser means who are in fact still driving a conventional used vehicle, which isn't going to go away very quickly, frankly, that there's some way to hold harmless people from the TCI induced price increase per gallon of fuel that they're putting in their tank. And this corporation will probably also have to carry responsibility the day-to-day measurement and execution and achievement of social equity goals. So in essence, you have a lot of expertise and people who are every day tackling this problem within the parameters specified by the climate action plan written by your council. Just float that idea and hopefully it starts some conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, George. Anybody else? Peter?
Nothing else for the group?
I'm sorry?
I don't have anything else for the group. I think we can adjourn.
Okay. All right. Thanks very much, everybody, and back to work.